19 by Lorne Dixon. Ye. Baozai adjusted the elastic band that cupped the breathing mask to her face. There was no one else loitering at the edge of the water, so risk of infection was nil, but the stench that drifted up off the Yatsé River was enough to turn her stomach. Staring down the waterway, she studied the jagged line in the tide where the water changed from algae green to a murky brown, the color of cardboard boxes and ancient concrete. A black-crowned seagull surfed the length of discarded styrofoam towards the shoreline. In the distance, maybe as far upriver as Yanquin, the drone and ping of factory work reminded her that just miles away life continued. But not here. She wondered how cold the water would feel when she jumped in. Would the pollution burn her eyes? How would her lungs feel as they filled with each involuntary gasp as she sank? Would it hurt to let go? I hope it hurts, she thought. Maybe that'll mean something then. Still, the odor drifting up from the water was familiar, if not pleasant, and a great deal better than the lingering scent of hospital corridors. 30-hour shifts followed by a 10-hour reprieve. That's worn her down. The memories of even the worst days before the virus, when a patient's wandering hand could have counted as a bad date, or the coffee grounds in the nurse's break station had brewed up stale, seemed so distant that she categorized them as a myth. Menze kissed her collarbone and whispered, "I'll never leave." But he had. 4 weeks into the outbreak, his fever started and her heart stopped. He'd seen hundreds of patients, all with the same ailment, and the masks that he'd worn protected him from all but one. One, which was the same as saying it had failed on every count. A week later, the hospital's power went down for 7 hours. The ventilator attached to his face went still. Then he followed its lead. Yes, the water would be cold, she decided. "Aren't you scared?" a voice said. For once, it wasn't Menze. The voice was deeper, and the Mandarin was awkward and lacked the region's twang. She knew it belonged to an American before she even turned to face him. He was a dark-skinned man hiding most of his features behind a white mask. A professional camera swung at his hips from a long leather strap. What little she could see seemed attractive enough if you liked the type. Her type was no longer breathing. She made a quick shuffle to retreat. She wasn't afraid of him or even the microorganism that might be stowed away inside his lungs, but the idea of talking to another human being was just too much. There was only one subject left, and she'd heard enough of that. "Hey, no, wait," the American said. His voice didn't plead, but it carried a desperation that stopped her feet. She was raised to be kind. It's all she knew, even if her degree from the medical university begged to differ. He jerked as if to step forward, but then stopped himself. Baozai brought a hand to her mask and made sure it was snug. "My name's Gladson," he said. "I'm a journalist from America. I've been here since the outbreak, but now I can't go home. I'm not even working anymore, really. I'm just kind of stuck." The wind kicked up, and the lapel of her coat flapped against her cheek. It felt so much like the gentle but firm hand of her mother. Those childhood slaps were a half-faded memory, much like her mother. The sudden contact shocked her into speech. "We're all stuck." His eyes squinted. She imagined a nervous smile hiding underneath his mask. "I didn't mean to bother you. I just wanted to hear what it sounded like to hear another human being talk. It's been a while." Baozai flipped her collar down. 6 days. "Think I've got you beat," he mumbled. She cocked her head to one side. "How long?" "Week and a day," Gladson said. His voice crackled with caution. He shuffled a little bit in place. She guessed he didn't really know what to say, as if a week and a day had already softened his speaking skills. No, she thought. This thing has made us all feel guilty for being social at all. He's trying to convince himself that he's not a monster for merely saying hello. Not wanting him to struggle, she said, "I'm Baozai." He leaned in. Of course, from his safe distance it would make no difference, but she got the message and repeated herself a bit lower. He nodded. "Baozai." "Baozai," she said a third time, then waved him off when he tried the pronunciation again. "We all feel like children again, fumbling our way through the world." "Good to keyboard you," he said. his hands extended as if to shake hers, but then shot up and tilted from side to side in an awkward little wave. She laughed. Jaiman. Meet. What did I say? Gladson said. Jaipan. She didn't know the English word. Instead, she raised both hands and wiggled her fingers over an imaginary keyboard. It felt silly, yes, and childish, but she laughed. It was the first time she'd done so in many weeks. He laughed, too. Sorry. I learned Mandarin in the States from an old Chinese guy who came over when he was 9. I found out that he'd lost more than a few words. She understood maybe half of what he'd said, but it was enough. They stared at each other for 2 minutes without speaking, 6 feet apart, safe from both the virus and any sense of intimacy. Finally, he dropped his gaze to his shoes. I should be going. Not supposed to be out, and they're patrolling, but I come this way about every day. Maybe I'll see you again? She nodded. Maybe. Gladson headed up the incline towards Yangzhen Avenue. Months ago, it would have been clogged with cars. The air would have been filled with the sound of car horns blasting and voices shouting. But the street he crossed was empty except for a single seagull walking down the center line. He glanced back at her. Twice. She turned back to the river. Baozai woke on the rattan love seat. She'd found a stream of old Calabash Brothers cartoons and watched them until she'd fallen asleep. She hadn't been a fan as a child. She always thought of it more of a show for boys, but watching it now brought a sense of calm. She might have disliked it as a child, but her mother and father were still alive and they could walk to the market hand in hand surrounded by their families. She could buy dragon's beard from the white-haired man who sold candy by the piece out of tall jars. The television was dark. It had turned off automatically. Her parents' cremated remains were buried in Jiayulong Palace along with her grandparents and uncle. The market was closed. There were no jars full of candy to be bought. Baozai rolled onto her back and stared up at the ceiling. No thoughts, no daydreams. She knew where they would lead, and she refused to give it any chance. Not that it would be a good day, but she could at least hold off crying for a little while. She gathered up her clothes and headed down the hallway to the floor's bathroom. It was empty as usual. She hadn't seen or heard her neighbors in weeks. Most had fled in the earliest days of the infection. Some, she assumed, were still in their apartments. Sometimes a lingering odor outside a door assured her that she was right. The water pressure seemed to have decreased with the city's population. She spun under the dribbling showerhead. The pipes coughed and rattled. She didn't allow herself that particular metaphor. She dressed. A nurse's salary didn't afford more than department store fashion, and at one time that would have bothered her, but not anymore. Whenever she had plans to meet with Menzies, she'd at least match her underwear. Today her bra was tan and her panties blue. It didn't matter. Neither one matched her white mask. She almost made it down 5 flights of stairs before the tears came. Almost. The streets were quiet, that new normal, with only pigeons milling around the shuttered storefronts. The handwritten signs on the doors, closed, rustled in the gentle wind blowing down Sanyang Road. An enormous white wall blocked the wide double doors of the Chinese Mengsheng Bank, a metallic skyscraper that was once the hub of foot traffic in the district. It said that the bank would only reopen once the emergency was over and that all the money had been removed from the site. From the crowbar marks on the edges of the wall, it seemed that not everyone believed it. A stray dog, its white curls stained yellow and brown, followed her for a block. Its eyes were milky and watering. Once a pet, surely, but now one without a master. There were only a few ways that would have come to be, none of them good. The dog either lost interest or deduced that she had no food to beg for, and abandoned her at the corner to explore the doorstop of the hot pot restaurant. You be careful, little one, she thought. Some people are ignorant and hungry. Navigating around the remains of a wooden pallet, Baozai made her way to the community center that capped the street. She'd taken driving lessons at the school here, although it was also the last time she'd ever been behind the wheel. Her parents had wanted her to have the additional ID. In a country of 1.4 billion people, misidentification could have horrible consequences. The more ways to prove her identity, the better, her father insisted. She crossed Shengli Street and stood at the edge of the Yangtze. Staring down, she found the impressions of her shoes from the day before still cast in the mud and settled her feet back into the exact same spot. There was even more garbage flowing in the river today: wood planks, molded styrofoam, plastic jugs, and foam insulation boards. The push for a green china had apparently ended the moment the epidemic began. Thankfully, the strong tide kept the debris moving, with only a few bits of trash clinging to the shoreline. But later in the day, she knew, the flow would slow. To the rest of the country, we've become a landfill, no more than that, a place to store the country's waste. Baozai wondered where all the boats were moored. She'd become used to the river as a bustling thoroughway of merchant boats, sailboats, and police ships. Besides the steady flow of bobbing trash, the waterway was empty. Squinting, she tried to make out the shoreline on the other side of the river, but a billowing fog erased any indication of the western fast food restaurants, supermarkets, and government buildings. She crossed her arms and wished the stray dog with cataracts in its eyes were still at her side. "It's you again." Gladson came up from behind. He slid into position beside her, hands draped over the boardwalk railing. 6 feet away, of course. When their eyes met, he asked, "Again or still? Did you even go home?" She blushed and waved one hand back towards the city. "All this is home. Or was. Anyway." He nodded. "Yeah, I mean, Atlanta's seen its share of trouble, too. Not like this, but no, yeah, trouble. I spent so many years there trying to get out of there. Now, all I want to do is see it again." She felt the corners of her mouth tighten. "Homesick." "Don't think I'm alone in that," he said. "Home. Sick." "Anyway," Gladson said as he pushed off the railing. He turned his body and faced her, his eyes filled with deep-seated concern. "You come here every day, I guess. So do I. I'm staying up at the hotel on Jaifang Ave. The one with the brown brick. You know it?" She nodded cautiously. "They treat me pretty good, all said, probably because I'm an American or a journalist or whatever. Point is, I can still get some things, if you need anything." His words took on an unsteady tenor, as if he was questioning his decision to ask at all. Baozai resisted the urge to politely decline. She knew that particular custom wouldn't serve her well. Finally, she asked, "Dragon's beard." "Excuse me?" he stammered. "A dragon's beard?" They both laughed. She gestured with her hands, miming opening the candy wrapper before realizing he wouldn't have any idea what her motions meant. "Candy, it's like," she thought for a moment, "cotton candy." Now his voice raised in excitement, as if in understanding the reference he'd solved a riddle. "Like at the state fair up at the Speedway, you have no idea what I'm talking about." "No," she admitted. "Speedway? Nah, it's not important," he said. "Just a place where I used to go with my grandpop. He was like a father, which is good because I needed one. Some of my best memories were with my grandpop at that fair. We ate all kinds of candy, but I definitely remember cotton candy." "Dragon's beard," she said, and ran a hand down her mask and past her chin to illustrate an invisible beard. A small involuntary laugh escaped her. "You know what?" Gladson said. "When I get back to the hotel, I'm going to walk right up to that short old woman at the desk and ask her to get some dragon beard candy for me. No promises, but we'll see how that goes. Sound good?" She nodded vigorously. It did sound good. In fact, she was beginning to think the sound of his voice was more important than the chance of getting a hold of some sweets. Squinting again, now because she was smiling under her mask, she thanked him. "Jizi Nin." His eyes were squinting too. "You're welcome." San. The thunderstorms passed overhead, leaving the streets clean except where the clogged drains overflowed and the gutters became rivers. When the sun finally emerged, the skyline filled with bursts of color as the steel and glass of the city reflected 1,000 prisms. As she stepped down from the last step of her apartment building, Baozai shielded her eyes with one hand. It was beautiful, but it hurt. Beauty and pain, she thought, best summed up in one word: life. She'd been awake for 4 hours. She'd brushed her teeth, showered, dressed, yellow and blue, and read a few pages from a 4-month-old home fashion magazine. In all that time, Baozai realized, she hadn't thought of Minze even once. How long it had been since he'd been out of her head for that long? She felt a tickle of guilt, but as soon as it emerged, it withered away. She headed for the water's edge, the same as she had every day since the crisis began. But once she reached the bank, she stopped. If she turned right a block earlier than usual, the trip would take a few minutes longer, but the scenery would change. Perhaps those streets would be just as depressing, but she felt different today. She turned. The walk was no better. Closed. The rain had washed away her footprints at the boardwalk. For a moment she froze in place, trying to figure out exactly where she'd stood for so many days in a row, where she'd been that last day with Minzy. Her head on his shoulders, still both wearing their scrubs. The next day he'd been sick and taken to a different wing of the hospital. She had tried to visit, but the police guards wouldn't allow it. She stepped up and gripped the rail. The view of the river was different. She was probably no more than a foot from her normal place, but it felt completely alien. The slope of the far bank and the railways beyond seemed closer. She waited for another tickle of guilt, but it didn't come. Her hands relaxed on the rail. She felt a little airborne foam from the river sprinkle against her forehead. Cold. So different from the hot tears she'd felt at the water's edge so often. "I was worried you wouldn't come today," Gladson said, propping himself against the rail 6 feet to her right. "Last night must have been 10 o'clock. I got a knock on my door." His mask was orange today. It looked good against his chestnut skin. He held a gold fabric pouch with a red tasseled tie. She recognized it immediately. A candy bag. The smile that grew on her face threatened to slide her own mask right off of her. Dragon's beard. "You," he said, pointing, "should have seen the old girl's face when I asked for it. She made me repeat it 6 times to make sure she understood what I wanted. She was shocked that I even knew what this was." "You didn't," Baozai said. He cocked his head to one side. "But she didn't know that. I kind of like surprising her like that. Seems like all the surprises these days are all bad news. Candy, that's the sort of surprise I think we could all use a lot more of." He fumbled to open the sack. After a moment, the cord uncinched. The scent of spun sugar and fruit emerged. Memories of her childhood flooded back. When was the last time she had a taste of dragon's beard? She couldn't even hazard a guess. Too long, she decided as an answer. Entirely too long. Gladson extended his arm, offered her the candy. His hand was 3 feet from her, closer than she'd been to any other human since she'd left the hospital after Minzy's death. She reached out slowly, 2 fingers out like chopsticks, and pinched a corner of the candy between her fingers. "You can take the whole thing," he said. "I got it for you." She tore off a bit and brought it back. Lowering her mask, she felt a strange thrill, as if she were doing something exotic and forbidden and perhaps deliriously dangerous. "No, you should try some." He took a little for himself. "At the same time?" "Yes," she said. He lifted his mask over his head. "Okay, son." Smiling, she said, "Er?" "Ye." The dragon's beard wasn't the freshest he'd had, or even the flavor she would have chosen, but as the sugar hit her taste buds in an intense rush of sweetness, she felt a wave of euphoria wash over her. Fragments of her childhood flashed through her mind, a school field trip to the Yellow Crane Tower, dancing with her father at the sands of Wichung River Beach, helping her mother with the wash, laughter, smiles, life without face masks. Gladson's nose wrinkled and he puckered his lips. "You don't like it?" she asked. He said, "I like watching you like it." She felt heat settle onto her face. Blushing? Another in a long line of lost arts, but now resurrected. She reached out for another pinch of candy. As she did, she took a single step closer. They stood 5 feet apart. Both of their stares dropped to their feet. Silence came in like a winter's wind. Then, Gladson followed suit by taking one of his own steps, bringing the tip of his toes to within 2 feet of hers. She ate the candy. He watched her with a growing smile. See. Baozai awoke in the epicenter of an earthquake. No, she realized, the bed wasn't shaking, nor were the walls, the floorboards, or the foundation of the apartment building. It was her. Her chest convulsed with each violent cough. She tried to gasp between each hacking lunge, but the air wouldn't penetrate her throat. Eyes bulging, she rolled off the bed and clutched at her neck, desperate to breathe. The hardwood floor felt cold enough to flash weld to her bare skin, but she knew that, too, was wrong. It was her body that was superheated. Tangs of pain struck with each attack, powerful enough to curl her toes. Finally, she propped herself up, ass against the mattress and face on the carpet, and heaved as hard as she could. A river of phlegm and vomit splashed off the floor and drenched her face with filth and heat. She collapsed, unconcerned about the mess she had landed on, and twisted herself over onto her back. She breathed in, filling her raw trachea and lungs. That caused a fresh stab of nausea. She sputtered up the remaining contents of her stomach through her slack-jawed mouth and nostrils. No, she thought. No. She stayed on the floor for hours, marinating in her own sickness and weeping until the alarm clock rang. It wouldn't stop until the mute button was pressed, so she forced herself onto her weary feet and stumbled to the bedside table. Her pointer fingers shook, but after a few false starts, she managed to shut the fucking alarm off. Her fingers dropped onto the half-empty bag of dragon's beer that rested beside the alarm clock. For a fleeting moment, she hoped that the candy was to blame, that perhaps that desk clerk had only been able to find expired and... Stop it. Now, you're a nurse. You've seen hundreds of cases. You know what this is. Crossed fingers and blind hope won't change a thing. She sat on the edge of the bed. The tears stopped. When she'd lost her parents to the disease, there'd been depression and anger. When it took Menzie, frustration and rage. But now, with her heart beating fast and heavy in her chest, she felt none of that. She just felt small and weak, and finite. She didn't think. She just turned her head towards the bedroom window and watched through the blinds as gray clouds curled around the muted yellow sun. Human beings excelled at finding patterns and shapes in randomness, but Baozai was in no position to play those games. She saw no faces in the clouds, no long-necked cranes, no looping dragons. When the clouds overtook the entire sky, she gathered up fresh clothes and headed down the hall to the washroom. One apartment door slammed shut as she passed by, the occupant no doubt dashing away from the sight of the infected. Baozai spun the lever fully to the right, but the shower of steaming water never felt anything more than lukewarm. She spat endlessly onto the tile floor, but the phlegm never stopped. She let the water run for a few minutes after she stepped out, then wiped the stall down with a liquid disinfectant from the supply closet. She followed up the heat and chemicals with a quick prayer to her great-grandfather, a man named Quaisan who she'd never met. His portrait hung over the family shrine. I'm not religious, she thought. Just desperate. She wrestled with her clothes, elbows and knees bending and contorting, until her matching pink bra and panties were in place. She stared into the full-length mirror against the tile wall. Had she been pretty? Or had she always looked like this, a swollen, lopsided monster? Bring on the villagers and torches. Her blue skirt and white blouse followed. Both were ordeals to work onto her body. Head swimming with nausea and her equilibrium failing in fits and starts, she wobbled to the stairs. She stopped, eyeing the elevator at the end of the hall. A handwritten sign hung on the scratched and dented chrome doors. Out of order. It'd been that way long before the virus hit. Baozai'd never been inside. Glancing down the hall for watching eyes, she tore the sign down and pressed the down button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the doors opened. A strong whiff of mold and mouse shit reached out to welcome her. She stepped inside, turned to the control panel, and pressed 1. The door closed. She turned her head and coughed in the crook of her arm. It left a yellow stain behind. The elevator shook, then descended, before landing with another shake and an electric chime. The doors opened again. A man stood in the center of the common area, eyes wide over his blue contractor's face mask. Is it the elevator, the lack of a mask on my face, or just me? As she passed precisely 6 feet away, she said, "Good morning." Dark, but funny. Contractor man plastered a hand against his mask, making sure it was tight fit to his face. Then he hustled to the stairs, glancing back twice, making sure that I don't try and follow, she thought. The streets hadn't changed. They were still gray and brown, filled with potholes and asphalt and cracks in concrete, and empty. My ghost town, she thought, as she stepped off the sidewalk and headed to the middle of the road. Here I am, your newest ghost, come to haunt. When she reached the center white line, she planted both feet on the old paint. Like a child, she tightrope walked, heel to toe, arms outstretched. After 4 steps, her balance faltered, and she fell. She struggled back to her feet and tried to brush off the dirt, but a dark stain remained. She headed towards the river, passing the shuttered storefronts and empty bus stops. She did not turn before she reached the China Mensheng Bank. Instead, she walked a block further and headed south. At the next intersection, she found the dog with the cataracts in its eyes lying next to an overflowing city dumpster. Fur matted and weather worn, she guessed it had been dead for a full day. She wished its eyes had been closed. It stared up at her with a gaze as empty as the streets. Had someone dumped it there, meaning to throw it out, but finding the container already full? Is that the best they could do for this poor creature? Baozai winced. She pulled a length of torn tablecloth out of the trash and bent over to cover the dog's body. Not quite a burial, but it was the best she could do. She remembered the rumors that she'd heard of government bulldozers and mass graves. The tablecloth didn't seem quite as heartless. She whispered, "Goodbye, for now." Sniffling as she stood, Baozai wiped her face with her sleeve and felt dirt replace the mucus at the edge of her mouth. It tasted rich, like coffee grinds. Very stale coffee grinds. Nurse station coffee grinds. She didn't bother trying to swipe it away. It didn't matter. The flavor of her swollen mouth was worse anyway. What street is this? She didn't recognize it. The buildings looked somewhat familiar, but she couldn't place them inside any context. Surely she'd been down this street at some point, but she couldn't tease the memory up from her subconscious. Baozai turned. East? I need east. Which way? She couldn't tell. She glanced up at the sky for the sun's position, but the gray clouds covered its entirety. Like a blanket, she thought, or a tablecloth. She went. East or west, she didn't know, but it felt better to have her feet in motion, to be going somewhere rather than waiting in place for her head to clear and her senses to return. Red graffiti on a yellow road sign read, "Cheated?" In another time, the vandalism would have been removed quickly, probably within hours of appearing, but the city planners evacuated long ago, and the police stayed safely within their cars, windows drawn. Or maybe, she thought, they agree. Maybe they, too, feel cheated. Her feet clapped against the asphalt without rhythm as she shuffled towards the next intersection. Besides that, the city was as silent as the empty echoes inside a seashell. Its voice, the chatter of pedestrians on their phone, the squeal of taxi brakes, the machine gun percussion of building sites, had been silenced. The road sign graffiti wasn't an expression of thought. It was a eulogy. At the corner, she caught sight of the entrance to the community center's southern edge. A weird unfamiliarity still clouded her thoughts, but she thought she knew where she was. The river was just beyond the spot where she'd learned to drive. She stumbled forward past the broken pallets and black garbage bags filled with waste towards the water's edge. Someone stood in her place at the rail. She wiped at her eyes to clear her vision. Baozai cried, "Gladson!" The American with the dark skin didn't turn. She rushed towards him, nearly falling when her weak knees buckled, but remained upright long enough to collapse against the rail at his side. Startled, Gladson retreated. He stopped 6 feet away and held out one hand. Above his face mask, his brow dropped and his eyes squinted. In English, he shouted, "You just stay right there!" Breathing heavy, she took a single step towards him. He backed away, 8 feet. "Gladson, it's me," she squeaked out between labored breaths. "It's Baozai. I fell before, and I woke up sick, but it's me." She saw confusion swim in his dark eyes. "It's me. Look, I don't know you, lady, and you look like you got it, so you just stay back." His voice took on a sharp tone, as rough and violent as a buzzsaw's roar. His outstretched hand curled into a fist. "I don't want any problem." Baozai leaned against the rail. Tears started up again, as hot as tea and as thick as before. She slid down the railing's post and sat on the walkway. "Gladson," she said in her own stuttering English, "it's me." Gladson's eyes bored into hers. "You stay there and get your head straight." Whatever clarity she had in her vision washed away. Gladson blurred into a murky outline as he turned and walked quickly back up the roadway. He glanced back at her twice, but this time she understood it was to make sure that she wasn't following. She wept. For her parents, for her brother, for Minzy, for the parade of patients she'd seen at the hospital before she'd walked away from that thankless job, for the stray dog who died on the street for no goddamn reason. And at the same time she grieved for all these, she cried for herself. No one else would, she knew. The government said that the elderly and those with underlying medical conditions were most at risk. But who hadn't the virus made old and bitter and sick? Who could really say they didn't suffer from depression or anxiety in this city? When the tears stopped, Baozai struggled to her feet and turned towards the river. She saw the same polluted green tide as every day. She smelled trash and rot and the hate of an entire nation. She felt the sandpaper bristle of foam and sand brush against her skin with every gust of wind. She couldn't feel Menzies' arms around her. She couldn't remember her father's voice. But she did hear Gladson's voice again. And get your head straight. She felt the knot in her stomach tighten. Again, wiping her eyes with her sleeve, she stared at the Yangtze's bullish current and felt her heart drop. The cardboard and plastic and styrofoam waste were gone. Maybe it hadn't even been there to begin with, she considered, but the waterway was still full of debris. Bodies. Dead men, women, and children floated on the tide. Their arms flapped in the waves, inanimate but moving at the water's whim as if in flight. Some washed up on the beaches, but most continued downriver. The seagulls swooped in, landing on their chests and pecking at their skin. To the rest of the country, we've become a graveyard. No more than that. A place to store the nation's waste. Baozai ducked under the rail in between the posts and slipped through. She fumbled down the bank's steep decline until the soil gave way to brown sand and gray foam. She continued on, ankles then knees deep in the water. She felt the strong pull of its current. "Aren't you scared?" a male voice said. Maybe it was Minzy this time, or Gladson, or her father, or the old man in bed 81 in the ward who asked her name before the ventilator cut off his voice forever. She didn't turn to seek out a face. She knew there was no one to see. Waist down, the current grew too strong to resist. Her feet slid off the river's floor, and she glided on the tide. Bodies surrounded her, floating with her down the river. She passed a wooden sign, faded and waterlogged, that had washed up on the shore. Closed. Baozai closed her eyes. A cold hand brushed her cheek. After so long without human contact, it didn't feel like dead flesh. It felt welcome. She exhaled a deep breath and felt all of her stress and anxiety escape with her oxygen. The hand caressed her neck, her clavicle, her shoulder. She felt her body temperature normalize. Her heartbeat regained its normal rhythm. A second hand slid around her waist and pulled her close. She felt herself pressed up against a broad, muscular chest. They rolled in the water, taking turns underwater, until finally the motion stopped, her on top. She opened her eyes and smiled before settling down on Menzies' breastbone. Down the river, a seagull landed on an old woman's chest. She strained her head up and kissed Menzies between his ear and his slack jaw. He didn't respond, of course, but the feel of his body against hers was all that really mattered. Baozai held on.